Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Abigail Richardson-Schulte, and I'm composer in residence with the HPO. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by two of our composer fellows. Several years ago, we started a program for emerging composers to give them an opportunity to work with the orchestra and learn sort of the ins and outs of the business from the inside with us. So we have Maria Eduarda Mendes Martins and Andrew Clark. So today's session is to give you an idea of what it is like to be a composer today, what we love, what we don't love, and really just a little bit about our worlds as composers. And we'll also be watching some videos from our pieces with the HPO. So let's start by giving a brief introduction about ourselves. Maria Eduarda, take it away.
Thank you very much, Abigail. My name is Maria Eduarda Mendes Martins. I am a recent student at University of Toronto. I started my doctorate degree in music composition there this year. I did my master's degree in Victoria, British Columbia, before coming here. That's where I first came to Canada because originally I was born in Brazil. Did my undergraduate degree there, also in music composition. So I guess that may give an idea of how much we travel and how much we go around as composers and musicians of classical music. I eventually immigrated to Canada. I made a family here, both in the music community and an actual family. I got married, I worked. So now I am becoming, hopefully, a citizen of Canada.
Super. Andrew, how about you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. And good morning for those who are watching live. My name is Andrew James Clark, and I'm from Canada. So that's a little less interesting than Maria, but I've been in Canada all my life. I grew up in Toronto, and I went to the University of Toronto as well and studied music composition there. And in 2019, just before the pandemic started, I was really lucky enough to begin a relationship with the HPO, and I was allowed to be a composer fellow, and I got to compose for the orchestra, and we're going to listen to a piece a little later on of what I composed. I'm also a church pianist and a music theory teacher, and I bring in my relationships and income from all over the city, as many composers have to, but primarily I'm really trying to compose mainly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And we'll get into that a little bit later too, how composers make a living and all sorts of the things we end up doing. So as I mentioned, my name is Abigail. I am in my 9th season with the HPO as composer in residence. In September, it will be 10 years. Wow. And I'm writing a new piece for the orchestra, which will open our opening night. That's not public yet, but there it is. So that's really fun for me. And with the HPO, I end up doing a lot of community outreach, speaking in the community. I've probably spoken to a number of you before, and handle education and pre-concert talks and our composer fellowship program. So it's a really, really great place to be. I also teach on contract at the University of Toronto. I consider myself a full-time composer as well. And I also helped my husband out with a string quartet series in Hamilton called Chamber Music Hamilton. So yeah, a number of things. And I am originally from England. So we have three countries represented here. There we are. And we'll hear a little bit more about our stories as we go. So my first question to you both, really to all of us, is, how did we get into music? Andrew, how did you start off?
Sure. The more interesting question for me is, why did I stay in music? Because I've been taking piano lessons since I was 4, and I really didn't have a choice. My parents asked me to go, and to be honest, I didn't really like music for a long time. I disliked piano lessons so much I wouldn't walk into a room with a piano, probably until I was a teenager. My parents really fought me on that. But what eventually happened was I started playing in a tiny church in Scarborough, And there's a large West Indian community there, people from Jamaica, people from Trinidad, people from Guyana. And I learned how to improvise music while these people sang their church hymns, because they come from places where it's less common for them to notate and write stuff down. They're just so excited, they just burst out into song, and someone has to provide the chords underneath. So I started doing that, and I learned to be an improviser. And on top of that, I started studying music theory, and I was able to figure out what exactly I was doing by putting chords underneath people who would just burst out into song. So that's when I decided to stay in music, and was a little more, welcoming. And I would, in fact, go into rooms with musical instruments and would fight my parents less. So it was really learning to be an improviser and becoming integrated into a relationship, into a community.
Right. So improvising is really very much like composing. You have to think on your feet. And yeah, it's like composing on the fly. So you really got into music because you loved composing. That's interesting. How about you, Maria Eduarda?
It's interesting how my motivations to compose are similar to Andrew's, but my story is pretty much the opposite. I didn't start studying music until I was 16. And my parents, they didn't want me to study music because where I come from, this is not necessarily an essential part of a curriculum and an education. But at that time, when I was 14, 15 years old, I just felt a necessity, a very personal necessity that I needed to make music. I needed to play an instrument at that point for some reason. And maybe because it was such a personal impulse, they were a bit hesitant. They are like, okay, we're going to pay for lessons for you, and then you will stop taking lessons in 6 months because you see that's not what you wanted, kind of thing. So when I was turning 15 years old in Brazil, when a girl turns 15, it's like the sweet 16 here. It's like the big birthday. So when that happened to me, my mother, whom I lived with at the time, she said, okay, I'm gonna give you a electric keyboard, a little bit smaller than an actual piano, but you will have to learn how to play without lessons. And I said, okay, I can do it. And as I tried to learn how to play, I also, discovered patterns in the keys. I discovered that if I played notes in a certain way, it would always sound in a certain way. So that led me to start improvising as well in my own way. Probably my improvisations would have been much, much simpler than Andrew's, but I realized that I could do that. And after a while, I asked myself, why don't I just play these improvisations always in the same way? Why don't I make up an improvisation that will sound always the same? And that's when I started composing, and I never stopped.
Interesting. Yep. So improvising is a big part of that path to being a composer. Mm-hmm. For me, I guess I have a bit of an unusual story because when I was very young, I was deaf. I had so many ear infections from just a couple of weeks old that by the time I was about 3, they figure I couldn't hear. So I could hear when I was learning to talk, and I had an English accent, but along the way, I was not able to hear, and I took over lip reading. When my family was asked to move to Canada, my dad was an engineer, and they wanted him to head up the company in Calgary. And to do that, all of us needed medicals. And oddly enough, I failed the medical. And at that point, they figured out that I couldn't hear. And this was news to my family. That's kind of remarkable, but my parents didn't know. And they felt terrible about that because how can you not know your child is deaf? Well, I guess I hid it. I pretty seamlessly covered in lip reading. And my parents thought when I was looking away, I was just distracted. And they didn't know at school either. And I had been in school since I was 3. So this was at age 6 that I was actually diagnosed. So I was turned away. My whole family was turned away, actually, because they said, you can't have this. We couldn't be a drain on the healthcare system. And so the company pushed back pretty hard. And then they agreed to let me in if I went to 3 separate specialists. And if they all declared me clinically deaf with no hope of recovery, they would let me in. Great. So I went to these specialists in London, and I remember sitting there with headphones on, and they'd say, push the button when you hear something. And I was pushing the button because I could hear things in my head, but they were not what they were playing for me on the headphones. So anyway, I guess I was always very sensitive to sound and the imagination of sound. And we moved to Calgary. It turns out the last specialist was a friend, and said, Calgary has a very dry climate. You never know. Good luck. And within 6 months, all of the scar tissue had dried up in my ears, and that was quite remarkable. But my parents did not think to put me into music. Why would you put the deaf kid into music, right? And so I was very lucky to attend a school where, as of grade 6, we were all playing instruments and we're doing music for at least an hour a day in school, plus then band after school. Very, 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 very intense in that way. And I was so much into sports, particularly cross-country running. And my band teacher was also my cross-country coach, so that was great. So I loved that. And I had a neighbor who played piano. And so I would do everything I could to just get some time on my piano. So finally, when I was 12, my parents said, oh, okay, let's get her a piano. And then I started taking lessons with a very unusual character. He played country and Western piano. He was not a classical teacher. My parents didn't know where to send me. We were kind of in the country outside of Calgary, and there were not many options. It was this guy. And he ended up being incredible for me because right away he said, why are you playing this? What's the story behind it? What's the emotion? What are you trying to communicate? Why don't you make something up? Because I was already kind of making things up right from the beginning. And so I started composing right away. Just the same thing. Oh, I'm learning piano. I'm also composing. And so he would do things like say, oh, you love skiing? Well, write me a 30-second commercial for a ski hill. Now write music for a dog food commercial. Now do this. So always about communication and storytelling. And I should say too that he was pretty unusual. Aside from being a country and Western player, he kept goats. He deliberately lived off the grid with no electricity. So all of my lessons were by candlelight. And he trained the British Army in survival skills in the mountains. So quirky, very quirky. And this leads me to my next question, which was it an obvious career path? So for me, no, it wasn't an obvious career path. I thought, oh, I should really do the smart thing and go into science. So I went into science in university for a year. Actually, I shouldn't call it a year. I really lasted about 2 months. And then I just felt like I need to get out of this. I need to be in music. So I dropped some classes, practiced really hard, and then auditioned for University of Calgary at 17. So I've been playing piano for 5 years. I didn't realize it was a hard school to get into on piano. It's a good thing I didn't realize because I wouldn't have tried. But I got in just on probation. So I had to play more so they could just make sure I was making adequate progress. And right away, my very first class, my theory class, was with Alan Gordon Bell, Canadian composer, who said, welcome everybody. By the way, your final assignment is going to be to write a piece of music and play it in front of the class. And I thought, I am in the right place. And he was so great and so encouraging for Canadian female composers that, and people he had taught before me, Kelly Marie Murphy, Heather Schmidt, I just felt so supported. And also there was such a tremendous push to Canadian music. And so that is something that I have really kept. So I push Canadian music at the HPO. I'm very glad to have this program for you two and other composer fellows. And so grateful to have an organization that is with me on this. So that's my story. Now, I wonder for the both of you, was music an obvious career path for you? Maria Eduarda?
It wasn't an obvious path for me either, because as I mentioned, I started composing before actually starting to take music lessons. So the very reason why I started studying music, piano lessons, was so that I could have a register, so that I could have a notation of what I create, the music I create, so that I could learn how to notate the music I composed by ear. And so again, when I was turning 16, about a year later, after I got my keyboard, my mom said, okay, we can pay you some music lessons for a few months until you learn how to write, and then that will be it. And I said, okay. So when I started these piano lessons, the teachers kept encouraging me to continue. They kept encouraging my mom even. They were like, oh, let her continue. She's doing fine, you know, let it be. And so when I had completed a year of music lessons, piano lessons, I started thinking that, you know, I liked doing that. I liked doing what I was doing. And I thought, if I had a career in music, you know, I would probably not starve. So that was enough for me. I had contact with my teachers who all had come from this big university where I lived in the south of Brazil, and they seemed to be doing just fine. They seemed to be happy with their jobs, and I guess I was just building my personality, my identity, and classical music was becoming a big part of my identity at the time. So I started thinking, well, you know, maybe I should try to get into school. People warned me that, you know, the entrance exam for this university was very difficult. My colleagues tried for several years in a row and they did not get in. And my teacher said, you are still very green. You're still very new at this. Are you sure you want to try? But I was stubborn at that point. And I said, yes, I do. I want to try. So basically my teacher trained me for the entrance exam for the next 6 months. And I got in. I managed to get into the university when I was 17 as well. And I finished university. And at that point, when I was like 21, 22 years old, I was revisiting all this story in my head, and I started thinking to myself that was crazy, that maybe I should do something else, maybe I should have another career and have music as a passion. So I actually started studying psychology after I did my undergrad in music composition. But as I started studying psychology, this professor from University of Victoria, whom I had sent an email to one day, he started writing back to me and insisting for me to apply to the program, insisting for me to send information, for me to go. And I was afraid because I didn't even know if I was doing the right thing, and I had to go to another country and I had to move and, you know, to do a master's degree in a big institution at University of Victoria, and I didn't feel ready. But he insisted so much that I did what he asked me, and I got in, and that changed my life. So
it sounds like you had good luck with encouraging teachers. It's interesting too, as a teacher, I often wonder how much reality to give students about the business, to say, you know, are you sure you really want to be in this? Like, let's look at let's look at what your life will be like, versus, well, you've really got talent, you've got a passion for it, you should go for it. So you went for it, it's working out well for you, and that's great to hear. Andrew, was there any doubt in your mind? Was it music, or have you considered other careers?
As I'm participating in this conversation, I'm realizing, one, I've never talked about this stuff before, about my musical past, and two, how less romantic my musical journey has been compared to you two. Essentially, no, going into composition was never a career move for me. It's a little more, I'm almost embarrassed to say, I really just wanted to be a composer because I was super competitive. I just wanted to see if I could. That's basically what it came down to. What happened was, when young men are teenagers, they often compete. They compete in sports. We have lots of different categories that young men compete in. And because I was never good at sports. I've never the smartest in my class. Was never whatever. But because I've been taking piano since I was 4 and I could improvise really fast, I knew I was good at music. So that became my category to compete and try to prove myself to the world. So when I got to U of T, I actually didn't even want to become a composer. I wanted to study piano, but I could not compete with like the real tough piano players who had like professional concert pianist teachers since they were 4. I had just kind of done it myself. So I was like, oh no, what do I do? I'm having an identity crisis. Maybe I'll go into composition. So I actually started composing, I think probably only 4 or 5 months before I applied for composition at U of T. And I composed like a crazy person. Like I wrote, I think 10 or 12 pieces all on my own with no teacher, just some at the school and some at my house. And I held my breath and applied to the program, and I got in through a miracle. So unfortunately there wasn't an encouraging teacher who said you can do it. It was just me seeing if I could. I really like challenging myself. I know when I compose I grow, and music is how I rank my development over the years. So that's less romantic, but it's the truth. I just kind of doing this to see if I can.
That's really funny somehow, Andrew. But I'm glad you're finding your way, and you're a good composer. You should be here. That's great. Speaking of that, can you introduce the piece we're about to watch on video?
Sure. So this piece is called Helical Rising, and it was written just before the pandemic. I think I put the final bar line on it, I think 3 weeks before we went into lockdown. So I'm really proud of this piece for a number of reasons. First of all, I was so lucky to get a fellowship with the HPO. It was my first professional experience with an orchestra. Now, my background and that I just popped out of the wilderness from nowhere. It was my first experience with an orchestra. It was my first experience with professional musicians. And it was my first large ensemble piece. I had never written a piece for this many people, even though that was my dream / I wanted to see if I could do it. So I'm really happy that it got done. And I've said this before, but I'm so thankful to the HPO and this organization, because you can imagine being me now. I've written my first large ensemble piece for professional musicians, and then the pandemic happened. And I had to wait, I think, 1.5 years to see if it would actually get performed. We weren't sure if we could actually pull it off. And I remember I kind of put it in a drawer and thought, well, that's typical, unlucky me, whatever. And then I was so thankful that I think between the second and third wave, the HPO was able to run a concert and put it on. So thank you, HPO. The piece is called Helical Rising. The concert it was in was called Earth Shine, and that's the title of a piece about an earth and a moon by a composer named Jeffrey Ryan. And when I realized I was going to be in this program, I thought I should perhaps write something interstellar, like about the stars or about celestial bodies and stuff like that. So Helical Rising, it's a tough term to explain if you're not an astronomer, but basically it's like the sunset, but with stars. So sometimes the sun is too bright in the morning, and stars that we should get to see before it rises are washed out with sunlight. So my piece is a lot about things. I'm realizing it's secretly about me as I talk. So like things that you don't really see and then creep forward gradually and come into focus. So yeah, one thing I will say, which is interesting since we're revealing our secrets, I did something that I shouldn't have done when I got this piece because I was an amateur. When we write orchestra parts, typically when people see the orchestra, they think, wow, there's so many people. I have students who look at the orchestra and think, there's so many people. How did the composer write all those parts for each individual person? And I explained to my young students that no, actually, groups of people are playing a single part. So maybe there's only actually 5 or 6 parts that are being played and multiple people are playing one part. Now, because I was competitive and trying to impress Abigail and the HPO, I wrote a different part for every single instrument in the orchestra, and it almost killed me. I almost did not make the deadline that the HPO gave me to finish this piece. Luckily, I did, and it got performed, and it creates this really cool effect because, like there's so many stars in the sky, there's so many parts for all these instruments, and they all kind of play different stuff, and there's this cool wash of sound and echo effect. So that's what you can listen to if you're going to listen to this piece.
Fabulous. Let's watch it. So this is from a concert this past October 2021. The HPO performed at the Cotton Factory in Hamilton. Thanks, Andrew. That's great. I love that piece. It had so much energy. I mean, something that our music director is always saying to our composer fellows is write with energy, and you did it. You did it. It's great. We have quite a deep question from Daryl. Producing an exceptional composition, musical, literature, painting, etc., requires a special blend of creativity and structure. How do you balance the two forces to avoid being too bizarre or too derivative? That is a deep question for us composers. Absolutely. So any takers on this question?
I can speak to that because I'm not that old, so I can see the time frame in I have my own little timeline for my pieces. So when I got into U of T and I started composing really fast, everybody loved my music. And then there was a period of about 3 or 4 years where I had failed piece after failed piece after failed piece after failed piece, and I couldn't tell what was going on. And then I've actually just come out of that, and I'm having a series of successes. compositionally. And I think what happened, this goes to the question, for me personally, if I spend too long writing a piece, it becomes sour. My wife is also a composer. We call it overcooking our pieces, because I think the way I think of it, to your question, is you're asking about spontaneity, right? So we're all taught, we're all improvisers here. I can improvise something and it's all spontaneous and it feels really good and it's great in the moment. Now, secretly, if you recorded it and played it back, it might get really boring really fast, because the magic was in the spontaneity of the moment. A composition, on the other hand, is not like an improvisation to me. It's supposed to last a long time. You're supposed to be able to listen to it over and over and hear the multiple layers and it getting deeper and deeper. So I realized when I was first started composing, and I composed really fast, my pieces were more on the side of spontaneous, magical things that had just burst onto the scene, and people really liked that. But if I take a composition, for example, I wrote a string quartet, and I think I spent 2.5 years writing it. It's 20 minutes long, and that's a long time to waste on 20 minutes of music. And I wrote out all the magic and spontaneity because I really wanted to make it perfect, and the audience didn't like it. It kind of felt flat. So after these 2 periods in my life, I've learned now I have to write a piece. That's the spontaneous part. I have to fix it up as a composer to make it stand on its feet. But then at a certain point, I have to tell myself to stop. Because if I continue to edit and fiddle with my piece, all the magic spontaneity and all the creativeness will dry up, because I'm such a fiddling builder, and I'll work it out of my piece.
Yeah,
That's the best I
interesting.
can answer that question.
Yeah, I like your answer, Andrew. And something that Andrew and I have talked about is writing for different audiences. This is something that that came into play with HPO. So Andrew was writing music, which was, I would say, a little more on the academic side. And then, we talked about, look, who are the people coming to this show? How can you engage them in contemporary music? How can you give them a way in? And so I think your music really changed. And Maria Eduarda, that isn't your problem. You write music which is easy to grasp. We can, and we'll hear your music in a moment. But yeah, you give us material that we can recognize and grab onto. So we all have our own situations with this. I wear different hats as a composer, sometimes writing for family programs, sometimes writing for serious programs. And it is constantly a juggle of, do you write serious music? Do you write music for everybody? And we all have to find our own path through it. There's no clear answer. Now, question for you both here, and I'll answer it as well. What's the greatest thing about being a composer? Maria Eduarda.
For me, the greatest thing about being a composer is having a sound in my mind and be able to hear the sound out of my mind.
Yeah.
Having an inner image and seeing it materializing over and over again. Mm-hmm. This is what my life is based on, and I love it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Andrew?
For me, the greatest thing about being a composer would have to be when people get the story I was trying to tell them. I used to run a concert series called Classical Context. Maybe it's been on hold for the pandemic. But one of the things I got to do was I got to program concerts and curate and compose for them. And then I would stand at the back of the hall and watch people's body language in response to how they were hearing music. And you can, when you do that, when you're responsible for the programming of a concert, you can really tell when people are disengaged and when people are engaged. So there's nothing more rewarding than if my piece is on stage and people are really focused. They're not fidgeting. They're not looking at the program trying to figure out what is this supposed to be about? What am I hearing? They're really listening. And then you can tell when they genuinely appreciated what you said in your music. So that's the most rewarding. That's the best thing about being a composer for me, is when the message is clear and it gets across to the audience.
Yeah, so you can connect to them through your art and your imagination. Absolutely. For me, I mean, I love writing, and I love the whole concert experience and bringing something to life for people. Absolutely love it. Whether it's in a presentation or a piece of mine, sharing the love of music, absolutely. But also that every project is different. I really appreciate that. I think that if I did something else with my life, I would probably be a caterer because I like to create. I love food. But it would be a different project all the time. I wouldn't be making the same thing every day, you know, speaking of cooking and overcooking. I really do appreciate that and getting to work with so many different musicians and organizations. How about, what's the worst thing about being a composer? Andrew?
There's so many.
So many things. Oh no, we shouldn't let it out. It's a secret.
The worst thing about being a composer, for me, there's several different things I can talk about. For me, it's going between periods of hyper isolation and composing, and then returning to society with my composition and trying to get it performed. Because when I'm writing, I like to be alone for long periods of time because I like to work really hard and I like to isolate myself. I don't even listen to even other people's music during my really intense composing times.
Yep, I agree. Same thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's really good because I get the work done. But after a few months of that, when I have to go and talk and reintegrate myself back into society and have to meet with friends and colleagues again, I'm in this mode where I've been in my own imaginary head for like sometimes half a year. And then I have to go work with an organization and communicate what I was saying. That transfer from being absolutely alone to all of a sudden meeting musicians, telling them how to perform it, you know, talking to the audience, thanking people after the audience, hearing their feedback. It's really a back and forth. And sometimes it can be exhausting going back and forth between those two things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's something I can understand, but it doesn't impact me because I'm in front of audiences all the time with my job with HPO, but I get it. Yeah, that's an interesting problem I hadn't considered. Maria Eduarda?
For me, usually when I think up a piece, when I am going to compose a piece, the piece comes entirely in my mind, the whole concept, the whole idea. So I have to write it very quickly so that I won't forget the idea and it will still make sense in the end, the whole thing. So music is a language on its own, classical music in particular, and it's a language that is spoken throughout the entire world. So it's very, very important, especially in the music made now in the 21st century with so many details and so many differences that each piece can present. It's very important that as composers, we know how to communicate our ideas very clearly so that everyone in the world will be able to play it, will be able to understand it, will make sense, at least up to some level, to every musician who plays an instrument. We have to account for issues that every instrumentalist may run into when playing our music, and that takes a lot of time. So sometimes this notation or communication, this communication through the score, is something that I feel like I have to overcome in order to reach my idea.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so the worst thing for you is really just something actually to do with the compositional process, which is interesting. For me, it's the business. And I think, you know, you two are both young composers, you're both emerging composers, and you're going to find your way in the business. And as you do, and you probably know this already, there are a lot of different elements to it. For me, the worst part is marketing. I'm very happy to talk about my music in interviews, things like that, no problem. But I hate the little nitty gritty of updating my website. You know, I never do it. I hate doing it. It's something that nobody is bothering me about it. No one's sending me emails saying, update your website. Gemma gives me little nudges like, you know, you look at, you know, you can put some on your website, and I know I have to, but it's just something that falls away. So I kind of wish I had an assistant for that. We, as composers, we have to be entrepreneurs, and I hate that, and I hate having to sell my music, you know, that sort of idea. So that's definitely a negative side. And I would say too, I mean, I feel very, very lucky as a composer that I can make a living in it, and I do a number of things in music. I know a number of composers that have to do things outside of music. In completely different fields in order to make it work, or they're involved as arts administrators as well. So for many people, the financial side is a downfall, because, you know, you need some stability, and composition is up and down. You know, we apply for grants. A lot of people might think, oh, you know, we sit around and write what we want to write, and then release it to the world and people will come to it. That's not the way it works. It works in the business anyway, that organizations come to us, or musicians come to us and say, we want a piece. And then we say, okay, great, let's apply for a grant together or find some funding. And then it happens. So you always have to be, you know, a few steps ahead, making sure that you've got compositions lined up. So when this one finishes, you know, you jump into the next one. It's a business, and you have to have incredible contacts. You have to be going to your concerts and networking and having a drink with people and saying, yeah, I'd love to write for you. And then you can continue spinning things out. So that's something that you both have to learn is in your future. Yeah, there we are. We have to do a lot of different things as composers. Let's hear some more music. Maria Eduarda, can you give us a brief introduction to your piece, please?
Of course. My piece was composed for the concert Gemma conducts Mendelssohn, where they would play the big violin concerto in E minor. And when I had my first meeting with Abigail about this concert and the piece to be written for it, she said that I could think about the possibility of connecting my work to Mendelssohn somehow. And the other orchestra piece that I had composed previously had used a melody as the very foundation of the piece, which is very interesting because orchestra is like this huge ensemble, which is very suitable for big blocks of music, right? And I decided to write this piece based on one single line of music written in the 13th century by a king, the King of Castile, which is basically in Spain nowadays. And I took this melody and I orchestrated in a way that sort of reimagined this disposition of the instruments a little bit. Instead of thinking about it in blocks of music, I thought about it horizontally in the shape of a vortex, where the melody would spin around itself over and over again and become more slowly. And it's interesting because it produced a similar effect to what Andrew was describing in his music, in which it had this idea which was faint and kind of unrecognizable and became more and more clear over time. And I thought to myself, you know, I could do this same thing with the Mendelssohn violin concerto melody, the first little melody of the concerto. So it would be a different experience, and it was indeed, because the melodies are different. Like melodies written in the 13th century, they are longer, and they were structured in a different way. So it was, as a result, it was a different experience to compose the piece. But I decided,
well, let's listen to it now. We're going to run out of time unless we actually listen to it. So I think you've prepared it very, very nicely for us. We're probably going to recognize this melody, and we'll hear it shape up as the piece progresses. So let's listen. We're going to listen to the entire thing. All right, here is the piece from this last weekend, echoing Mendelssohn. So that was pretty special to hear that theme swirling around the orchestra and deconstructed right after hearing the Mendelssohn Concerto. So I think that's a great addition, and hopefully it will be programmed by other orchestras when they're performing the Mendelssohn. Andrew, any comments?
I really liked it. It is interesting how we kind of did the same. We kind of did the same thing. I took a theme and echoed it throughout the orchestra, and Maria also took a theme and echoed it throughout the orchestra. It's very interesting. I wonder if it's a consequence of how much chamber music we write when we're younger. It might be.
Maybe, yeah, yeah. Well, we just have time for one more piece now. So I wrote a piece called Making Light with librettist Alexis Diamond, and we were commissioned specifically to write something for a holiday concert. So I put my sort of family community hat on as a composer and wrote a piece for narrator, for adult narrator and child narrator. And the idea is that they're preparing, as a grandfather and granddaughter in this case, and they're preparing for this big holiday, Christmas specifically, get together when the power goes out, and they're left to their own devices and are worried about what's going to happen. And the grandfather ends up telling stories of different traditions from around the world and how they celebrate. And in the end, how light is at the core of all of these different traditions. So we have Ramadan and Christmas and Hanukkah. We're going to jump into the story at Diwali. So I used some 14th century North Indian tunes for this, and then put my own sort of rhythm and accompaniment to them. And then we'll hear the legend of the Northern Lights. This is an Anishinaabe legend, very specifically did not use any content, any indigenous content, and it's a very public story. So we have to be very careful when dealing with anything like this, that it is public and we're not taking anybody's story, and we're very clearly paying tribute to it and giving credit. And then you'll hear at the end that it all sort of comes together, and then they realize, you know, that their guests are coming, that kind of thing. So keep an eye out here for the cues. The narrators are taking cues from the conductor. So I set up sentences, you know, they might say a sentence or a couple of sentences that are always being cued, you know, when you can come in now, because the music really aligns with the narration. So that as a composer is pretty tricky to do. You might recognize actor R.H. Thompson here as well. It was great that he could join us. So let's watch this clip from Making Light.
That's what we need right now. A miracle of light.
You know, that reminds me of the story behind the Hindu holiday of Diwali. Diwali marks a story from Ramayana, the great Hindu epic.
What's an epic?
An epic is a huge story about a hero or a heroine from a certain culture or religion. And this epic is called Ramayana because it's about Prince Rama, and this Hindu epic led to the holiday called Diwali.
Diwali is celebrated where again, Pops?
In ancient India, northern India, in fact. And northern India also happens to have an ancient music tradition. Unlike our music, Western music, where a melody is played over chords, Indian music is improvised over a drone, a held note in the bass.
I wish we could hear what that sounds like.
Well, when the power comes back on, we can look it up, but you're just gonna have to rest on your imagination in the meantime. Now, back to the Diwali epic. The king of Ayodhya, he sent his son, Prince Rama, and Rama's bride, Sita, to live in the forest. But the king had been tricked by the scheming queen, his wife, who was also Rama's evil stepmother.
Like Cinderella's evil stepmother?
Yes, something like that. And in the forest, Rama and Sita thought they were safe.
But they weren't.
No, because the jealous king of Lanka, the demon Ravana, stole the beautiful Sita away.
Oh no, poor Sita. She must have been so scared.
She was, and Prince Rama too. So he assembled an army of monkeys and bears, and he attacked the kingdom of Lanka.
And that army of monkeys and bears beat that mean Ravana, right, Pops? And Prince Rama and Princess Sita were saved, right, Pops?
Well, Mila, the battle was long and it was fierce, but Rama won.
Yay!
Sita was safe.
Phew, I was getting worried there for a minute.
And at long last, the royal couple returned home to celebrate their return after 14 long years. And the people of Ayodhya lit up their houses with rows of lights. And they filled the night sky with fireworks, just like Hindus the world over do today. You hear that?
Sleigh bells! They're here! They're here!
Yep, the guests are finally arriving.
But Pops, may I have one more story? Fast, fast, may I please?
Okay, one more. This is short and sweet. And it comes from the Anishinaabe First Nations, whose lands now extend from the Great Lakes to the prairies. It's not really a holiday story, but it is my favorite tale of light. When Nanabojo, or Mishaboj, also known as the Great Hare, finished creating the earth, he moved away, way up north, where he could rest from his hard work of creation. But his people, the people that he created the earth for, they were never far from his mind and his heart. So, way up there in the sky, the great hare lit fires that can be seen for miles and miles. And that way his people knew that they were in his thoughts and they were close to his heart.
Could I see the fires that Nana Bojo lit? Could I?
You can. If you're lucky and if the skies are clear, they are the aurora borealis.
The Northern Lights. Hey, Pops, that's it. There was a Christmas before light bulbs, right?
So you think we can save the party with our own light?
Well, if people used to celebrate Eid and Hanukkah and Christmas and Diwali and all the other holidays without electricity, then we can too.
Brilliant, Mila, and that was a real light bulb moment. After all, that's what these lights mean, that the people we love and the people close to our hearts burn bright no matter where they are.
Coming together in the dark months,
We can make light shine in through the darkness.
Well, and then it ends up with a carol, with the audience singing, or with the child singing. The child in this case, her name is Mara Sweeney, and she's part of the Hamilton Children's Choir. She did a great job of memorizing the entire script. So it's always challenging to use a child actor, but she did very, very well. Daryl, thank you for your comments. Daryl says, thank you for giving special consideration when dealing with cross-cultural materials. Yes, absolutely. We take this very, very seriously. And R.H. Thompson gave a lovely introduction to the piece, in particular around this topic. So it's of course a very important field. Now, that is it for us today, but I have one last question for both of you, and that is, how has the experience been for you with our HPO Composer Fellowship? Maria Eduarda.
It's been wonderful. I've been thinking about that concert for the whole week. It was such a special moment for me. It was an intense process of learning. I learned at every step of the way, from when I was composing to when I was editing parts to when I was in rehearsals and during the concert as well. So it's been amazing. I am very grateful. I have mentioned this before, but I will mention it again. I'm so grateful to be part of this program.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Andrew, how about you?
Also extraordinarily grateful. This has been the highlight of my musical life so far. That's how exciting it's been. I can't wrap it up. I can't tell you how great it is within the time frame we have, but I am extraordinarily grateful. I told this to Abigail in private. Being able to compose Helical Rising for the HPO has already caused more opportunities to open up, because I could then take that recording and show other arts organizations and say, look what I can do. And they'd be like, yes, we want you. So it's already it's bloomed into a bunch of new opportunities. So I'm very thankful.
That's great. I mean, that the idea is that we help you start your career in the orchestral world. So I'm very glad to hear that. We have a lovely comment from Grace, who says, "I'm totally amazed. Composing is way beyond anything I could ever comprehend. Thank you to you all for your stories and your compositions." Well, what a lovely way to end. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Maria Eduarda. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for you watching at home, and we'll hope to see you at an event soon. Goodbye.